Good evening and welcome to the AOPA Air Safety Institute presents NTSB Insider Accident Investigations Revealed. My name is John Collins and I'm the manager of aviation safety programs for the Air Safety Institute. And I'm pleased to welcome tonight our special guest and presenter, Mr. Dennis Diaz of the NTSB Office of Aviation Safety. He's got a great program lined up for us tonight. Before we get started, just a few reminders. We will not be able to do any technical troubleshooting during the webinar, so if you experience any audio or video difficulties, I highly recommend logging out and logging back in. That usually clears them up. Also, we'll have a Q&A session at the end, so if you would like to submit a question for Dennis during the presentation, go ahead and use the question feature on the control panel. If you're using an Apple product, it's probably at the top, it's a question mark. If you're using a Microsoft product, you'll probably see it along the side somewhere. But just go ahead and click that and send us a question. We'll try to get to it at the end of the show. And then if you have any questions beyond that and we are unable to get to those, we'll try to get those answered and back to you. Also, tonight's webinar is also available for Wings credit. So if you signed up for the webinar with the email that you use at faasafety.gov in your Wings account, you'll automatically get that. If you did not, if you signed up with another email address and you know your Wings account email, please provide it to us in the comment section. We'll be able to, in the question section, we'll be able to add you to the list for that. Additionally, this webinar qualifies for the ASI Webinars badge in the AOPA Pilot Passport app. I'll have more information on that at the end of the show. Plus, at some point during the show, we're going to talk about, this is actually part one of a three-part series. So Dennis has some additional information, some teasers for you on our upcoming visit. So without further ado, Dennis, I'd like to turn the controls over to you. Thank you very much, sir. The controls are yours.
All right, thanks, John. I have the controls.
You have the controls.
Good evening, everybody. As John said, my name is Dennis Diaz, and I'm the chief of the NTSB's Office of Aviation Safety in our Eastern region, or at least that was my job up until recently, as I've been filling in as the acting deputy director for regional operations. We're the part of the NTSB that deals primarily with general aviation aircraft accident investigation. And tonight, that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about. Before we dive in, I should probably let you guys know a little bit about who I am. I've been with the NTSB for going on 19 years. And I was in the field investigating accidents for about 13 years before I became a manager. I'm a pilot, a flight instructor, I hold a light sport repairman certificate, a remote pilot certificate, and I'm currently seeking my next airplane. Let me know if you know of any good deals. So that's who I am. John, can you help me find out a little bit about who these folks are? In just a moment, you should see a poll appear on your screen. Please answer if you're a student pilot, recreational pilot, or sport pilot, private pilot, or if you're a pro pilot, the commercial, flight instructor, or ATP level.
We've got quite a lot of answers coming in. Seems to be heavily weighted towards private pilots so far, but ATP and CFIs are not that far behind. Some student pilots, excellent. And a few sport or recreational pilots. Very good. Thank you for joining us.
Awesome.
We'll let this run here for a little bit more. We're getting up about 75% of the folks voting so far, letting us know. There we go. Go ahead and close this here in just a few more seconds. All right, I'm going to share those results with you. Okay. There we go.
All right, yeah, lots of private pilots, ATPs and CFIs in second place there, some commercial pilots, and student and sport and recreational pilots. So great to have a diverse crowd here with us tonight. All right, so as we dive into our material here, first up, we're going to talk a little bit about the background of the NTSB. I'm going to give you a little bit of information to let you get to know us a little better, to talk to you more about the work we do and who we are. This foundational material will serve you well during the second half of the presentation and during those subsequent presentations in this series that John was alluding to. For the second half of the presentation, we're going to discuss some specific investigations to help you better understand what it's like to work through simple and then more complex cases. At the end of the presentation, I'll take a couple moments to talk about those upcoming presentations we're planning for this series. At the highest level, the mission of the NTSB is to determine the probable cause of transportation accidents and formulate safety recommendations to improve transportation safety. I want to stress that it's not our mission to place blame, determine civil liability, criminally prosecute, or otherwise enforce any laws or regulations. We have the ability to make safety recommendations, and we don't have the ability to, we don't have any enforcement powers or other mechanisms to make those recommendations binding. The NTSB is an independent federal agency, and that means we're not part of the Department of Transportation. We're charged with investigating every civil aviation accident in the United States, as well as some aviation incidents. In addition, we also investigate significant accidents that occur in other modes of transportation, including marine, highway, rail, and pipeline, as well as issues involving the transportation of hazardous materials in all transportation modes. At the conclusion of our investigations, we develop reports that outline the facts, conditions, and circumstances surrounding the accident or incident. The safety board then determines the probable cause of the event, and the board then may issue safety recommendations designed to help prevent future accidents from occurring. Accredited representatives from the agency may also assist in the investigation of events that occur outside the United States. In 1996, the Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Act assigned the Safety Board the responsibility of coordinating resources from the federal government and other organizations to support local and state authorities, as well as air carriers with family assistance following a transportation disaster. The NTSB finds its origins in the Air Commerce Act of 1926, in which Congress charged the Department of Commerce with investigating the causes of aircraft accidents. Later, that responsibility was given to the Civil Aeronautics Board's Bureau of Aviation Safety when it was created in 1940. The NTSB was formed from the Division of Aircraft Accident Investigation of the Civil Aeronautics Board in 1967. And that was when we were given our role in the investigation of transportation accidents in other modes besides aviation. The board was then made independent of the Department of Transportation by the Independent Safety Board Act of 1974. When I give this presentation to small groups, I'll typically ask for ballpark guesses on the number of staff that work at the NTSB. Let's take another poll to see what you guys think. Do you think we have?
All right, here we go.
All right. So do you think we have 500 employees, 5,000 employees, or 50,000 employees? I'd like your honest impression, just your first thing that comes to mind. Don't go Google it.
Well, the responses are coming in. We've got about 50%, a little more than you voting. That's good. We'll keep this open here for just a few more seconds. Awesome. All right. All right, we're going to go ahead and close the poll, and I'll show you the results. Dennis,
all right.
Go.
Looks like we got some smart folks in the crowd, almost 70%. Guessing that 500, and the correct answer is about 410 is about where we are right now. And this is pretty typical. Most of the time I get, folks raising their hand, and they give me numbers in the high hundreds to mid thousands. And I think most who don't follow the agency very closely are kind of surprised to learn that only about 400 people work here. And of those, only about 125 work in the Office of Aviation Safety. Generally, the investigative staff in the Office of Aviation Safety are responsible for investigating about 1,200 cases per year. All right, let's break that down a little bit more for you, and we'll look at the 2020 calendar year data. We're still tabulating that 2021 data, and the first cut of it should be coming out soon. There were 14 air carrier accidents in 2020, none of which involved fatalities. There were 45 accidents involving commuter and on-demand operators, and 7 of those accidents were fatal, accounting for 26 fatalities. And in general aviation, there were 1,139 accidents, 205 of which were fatal, accounting for 332 fatalities. The other side of this, the numbers discussion here, I think is important to highlight. It's our safety products that result from our investigations. But it's always difficult to put these numbers in perspective. As with accidents, they all represent different impacts to individual lives and to the industry as a whole. With that said, though, I do think it's important to at least mention them when talking about the big picture numbers. So keep in mind, these aren't safety actions associated with the outcomes of the investigations that occurred during 2020, but safety actions that were completed during 2020, which consequently were the result of investigations started many months and even possibly years before. Our safety recommendations are typically directed toward the FAA, but may also be targeted to reach more specific industry stakeholders, like manufacturers or industry trade groups. Generally, though, these are the broadest type of safety action the agency takes. And again, they're not binding. While our recommendations are relatively well known in the industry, the safety accomplishment isn't very well known or understood. Essentially, each safety accomplishment that you see on your screen there represents a situation where an NTSB investigator observed a safety deficiency and then took some tangible action by working with that industry stakeholder that resulted in a measurable change. These types of safety actions are generally local in nature, perhaps with an individual aircraft operator, maintenance organization, or local airport who might have some direct involvement with an aircraft accident. To better characterize this for you, one generic example might be a flight school who has a loss of engine power accident. After investigating those circumstances, the findings suggest that maybe that loss of engine power might have been due to fuel exhaustion. Our investigator might then make some suggestions, but not formal recommendations to that operator, such as improvements to their dispatch or fuel minimum policies that will hopefully prevent similar future recurrence. That operator isn't required to take that safety action, and unlike a formal safety recommendation, they would not even be required to respond to such a suggestion. Also, unlike safety recommendations, when those suggestions produce some tangible change, the safety accomplishment really, to me, represents an action taken versus an action we'd like to be taken. So I'm really always happy to see when these sorts of things are happening. Another tool in the NTSB's toolbox is a relatively recent development in our history, and that is the safety alert. This is another vehicle for us to reach out directly to a more broad swath of the industry to convey a critical safety message. Since safety alerts are a relatively recent product type, if you consider 2010 recent, I'd like to take a moment to show some recent examples. Back in 2019, we released a safety alert directed to aircraft fueling providers after several incidents that involved a loss of engine power in turbine-powered aircraft that were due to them having been fueled with fuel that was contaminated with diesel exhaust fluid. More recently, and I'd argue relevant to this audience, particularly at this time of year, was a safety alert regarding the hazards of flight in snow. You can access these and other safety alerts on our website at ntsb.gov/air. So that's a bit about the breadth of the work that we do. Let's take a moment to talk about who we are. The investigators who support general aviation aircraft accident investigators are based in the NTSB's regional offices and remotely throughout the country. These 40 investigators in charge are the folks you might typically think of when you hear about the NTSB responding to general aviation accident sites. Then they investigate the facts, conditions, and circumstances surrounding those accidents. They receive additional support from subject matter experts who bring deep levels of knowledge and specific skill sets when necessary. These include experts in aircraft operations and oversight, air traffic control, meteorology, aircraft structures, systems, and power plants, as well as general maintenance and airworthiness, human performance, the survival factors that surround crashes, like aircraft cabin safety, search and rescue, and airport safety, as well as writers, editors, and analysts who support our efforts to prepare and publish investigative reports. Additionally, the Safety Board has specialists who assist investigations across all modes of transportation. This includes help from our 24/7 Response Operations Center, who assists with receiving and disseminating accident notifications and who helps coordinate launches to accident sites. We also have specialists in the recovery of data from onboard recording devices, metallurgists and fire specialists, vehicle performance engineers, transportation disaster assistance specialists who assist in our coordination with and informing of victims' families, as well as specialists who help with responding to information requests from the media and other government entities. We also receive great assistance from our support staff who keep the lights on and the travel vouchers paid as we are out in the field doing our work. As we wrap up our overview of the agency and our amazing staff, I wanted to take a moment to highlight this for our audience of aircraft owners and pilots, and let them know that there are many of us across the agency who share your passion and enthusiasm for general aviation. Some of us are aircraft owners, others find time to instruct students in their off hours, some are renters who fly just for the fun of it, and some, like me, are between aircraft and beg, borrow, and steal flight time from our friends and family whenever we can. Because no presentation from the NTSB would ever be complete without a review of the regulations contained within Title 49, Chapter 8, Part 830, or just NTSB Part 830. Let's talk about the parts of those regulations most applicable to you, the aircraft owner and pilot. 830.5 states that operators of civil and foreign aircraft, but not military or intelligence aircraft, must notify the NTSB when an accident occurs. This regulation also talks about incidents that require notifications, but put a pin in that. We'll get to it later. Also, we do investigate remotely piloted aircraft accidents, and 835 talks about those criteria, but we won't be discussing that tonight. First, we need to define what an accident is. There are lots of specific words in this definition we have to look at closely. So read that bullet for yourself, and then we'll start to talk about it. After reading this first bullet, hopefully we understand that we have to be operating an aircraft with the intent for flight, and that the occurrence that's happening has to happen between the time the first person boards and the last person disembarks. So, for example, an unoccupied aircraft tied down on a ramp that's damaged by a thunderstorm is not an accident for our purposes. Moving on, this operating aircraft must be substantially damaged during the event, or there must be a serious or fatal injury that results from the event. So there's actually some more definitions we need to look at. Serious injuries include any of those listed here. And to be considered a fatal injury, death has to occur within 30 days of the accident. This is what substantial damage means. And here are the explicit exclusions as to what does not qualify as substantial damage. As you read through this list, can you think of a type of accident that it's trying to describe? For me, that conjures up an image of a gear-up landing, which naturally begs the question, why are there reports about gear-up landings in the NTSB database? The answer is because the damage to those particular aircraft in those particular occurrences had some kind of damage that was not listed in this list of exclusions and met that threshold of adversely affecting the structural strength, performance, or flight characteristics of the aircraft. We'll talk about this more specifically when we look at some examples later on. And what about those incidents we didn't talk about at the beginning of this section? In 830.5, there are several event types that require operators to notify us immediately. Some of those are listed on this slide. Once an operator notifies us of these events, it doesn't necessarily mean that we will or won't initiate an investigation. What we will do is log the event into our data system and possibly request additional information from the operator or other parties. We may then initiate a full incident investigation if we see the potential for systemic safety issues. One last note on regulations. I'd like to take a moment to talk about the aircraft owner and operator's responsibility for preservation of wreckage and records. Part 830.10 explains this in detail, and I think it's something that, in my experience, and it's unpleasant to think about, but some pilots, owners, operators have overlooked. It's certainly possible that after a no or minor injury accident, an individual aircraft owner or pilot may be in a position to carry out all of these responsibilities. Unfortunately, I've encountered too many situations where individual owner pilots were seriously or fatally injured and were not in a position to do this. Regardless of their condition, if the pilot has insured the aircraft, the insurance policy often includes provisions for carrying out these tasks. I'd encourage all aircraft owners and pilots to carefully review their policies to ensure that this is indeed the case, and to make sure that their family members know how to access this information. For those who elect to fly without insurance coverage, I'd encourage you to have some plan in place so that your loved ones aren't in a position to have to make sensitive and costly decisions on your behalf with no support. All right, with those definitions out of the way, what about our response? When do we send a go team? When does the FAA respond on our behalf? We break down our accident response types into three basic categories: major, field, and limited. Major responses are normally investigated by what has come to be popularly known as the go team. This is typically an investigator in charge who is accompanied by several subject matter experts who act as investigative group chairmen. Another distinguishing feature is that these investigators are accompanied by one of the 5 appointed NTSB board members who act as the agency spokesperson at the scene of the accident. Typically, these events involve large aircraft, and typically they're very high visibility. In today's aviation world, these types of accidents do still happen, but they're not very common. A field investigation is where an NTSB investigator in charge responds to the scene of an accident and normally do not have the assistance of subject matter experts. They may be assisted by people who we call parties to our investigation, who have specific technical knowledge that we might not possess within the agency, and the ability to translate early investigative findings into safety change. The investigator's goal at the accident site is to gather perishable information. Examples of this perishable information include the evidence that we get from looking at the site itself and from the condition of the wreckage in relation to that site. By looking at the objects the aircraft might have struck on the way down to the ground, as well as the crush damage on the wreckage itself, this can provide us with clues as to what the aircraft final trajectory or attitude was. Another thing to assess is whether the whole aircraft reached where the majority of the wreckage came to rest. Or are we missing pieces that might be spread across hundreds of feet or even across miles? We call this first look, establishing the 4 corners of the aircraft: spinner to tail, wingtip to wingtip. Before the wreckage is moved, we'll try to establish continuity of the flight controls to determine, to the extent practical, whether or not these might have been an issue. Another thing we look for is evidence of engine power, which you can get by looking at the engine itself, or the propeller, and the environment around the accident site. Oftentimes the general aviation aircraft we're investigating are not equipped with crash-hardened flight recorders, though in recent years this has started to change. We look to recover these and any other sources of electronic data that might have been on board the aircraft and take them back for further processing. We also try to seek out witnesses who might have something to say in the immediate wake of an accident and who might otherwise scatter to the wind if we weren't able to talk to them right away. If possible, it might also be helpful to have that conversation with them in the place that they were when they were perhaps, say, an eyewitness to the accident. This can aid in understanding what they might have seen or been able to see or not been able to see. Finally, this is often a good opportunity to try and locate the aircraft and pilot logs, though I wouldn't strictly classify this information as perishable since it's inherently contained on some kind of document. But it can be a convenient time to capture this information, especially if those records were on board the aircraft. To call the third category a response type isn't quite accurate. It's actually a case where we don't respond, but we still do investigate. This is a limited investigation. And while we don't physically respond, almost always an FAA inspector from a local flight standards district office does, and they act as our eyes and ears on the scene of the accident. They work to gather that perishable information on our behalf, and we're always appreciative of them for those efforts. The FAA, who is a party to every NTSB investigation, also has to look into what they call their 9 areas of responsibility in order to determine whether or not any internal part of the FAA might need to take some other action in the interest of safety. These areas include performance of air traffic, aircraft or pilot certification, or airports in part. After passing back to us what information they learned at the accident site, we might then arrange to do some additional investigative work to include traveling to examine the wreckage after it's been recovered, or doing more detailed examinations or tests. With that in mind, I think it's important to remember that in these cases, while the FAA may initially be the only ones visible at the accident site, at those accident sites where the NTSB doesn't respond, the NTSB still is in charge of the investigation and will eventually produce a final report. All right, now I'd like to transition to talking about the investigative process by walking through some examples. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to say that we're going to discuss real pilots who were involved in real accidents. We're going to talk about those cases from a perspective of trying to learn about how those investigations unfolded. And hopefully in the process, we'll also find some takeaways that might help to make us better pilots. It's all too easy to place blame and pick apart the decisions others might have made after the fact. So I encourage all of us to have a spirit of grace and humility as we look at these examples. And remember that at various points in our past or in our future, we might be facing the same or similar pressures as these pilots did. With that said, let's work through a case study, starting from the time we receive the initial notification to the time our final report is published. I'll start this discussion this evening by looking at a very simple recent case that occurred this past summer in North Carolina. The first indication that something has happened often comes to us through the FAA. While Part 830 specifies it's the owner-operator's responsibility to notify the NTSB of an accident, in many cases, our first notification of an event comes from some FAA air traffic facility via the FAA's 24/7 regional operations centers. The example text here is typical of the type of information, initial notification we might receive via mobile text or email message. The investigator at the NTSB who receives this notification would be performing the specific job of duty officer, which is a rotational assignment amongst all regional investigators. The duty officer's job is to gather any additional information that's initially available to help us understand what type of event we're dealing with and to help determine whether or not the NTSB should respond to the accident site. NTSB duty officers triage dozens of notifications every day, and the vast majority do not meet the threshold of our definition of an accident, as we just discussed. In the case of this event in North Carolina, since thankfully there were no reported injuries, that makes their job a little bit easier. Now they need to determine whether or not the damage to the airplane meets those criteria in Part 830 for substantial damage. At first glance, we can see the propeller and landing gear damage, which is explicitly excluded from consideration. What stands out significant in this case, and you have to look closely in the background there, is the damage to the horizontal stabilizer, but also to the right wing. This meets our definition of an accident, and we will have some more work to do. I want to caveat and say this damage determination was easy, but there are many times when the damage is not so obvious and more work will need to be done to make that determination. We now know the outcome of the event, but we still don't know what happened. For that, the best source of first-hand information is often the pilot or operator. We'll often interview the pilot via telephone as soon as is reasonable after the accident, given their condition. As part of that conversation, we'll ask the pilot to complete our 6120.1 pilot operator report form. In this case, the pilot told us this was a straightforward case of a landing gone awry. Based on all the information we gather through that initial triage, we're pretty quickly able to determine that there aren't any mechanical deficiencies that need to be examined or ruled out. So we take the pilot statement, the damage documentation, as well as any additional supporting documentation, and add them to our public docket. We then prepare a concise report that explains the circumstances and makes the data about this case available to the public. This is done in part so that we or others in the industry can examine that data in aggregate to determine if there are any underlying systemic safety issues present that might not be apparent when looking at this single, seemingly straightforward case in isolation. This was a very simplified overview of the basic steps involved in what we would commonly call a data collection investigation. Now we'll take a look at a case that's a little bit more complex. For this case, we're going to step back to May of 2017 and head down to Georgia. We've been notified of a Cessna 150 that lost engine power and performed a forced landing to a field. The pilot and sole occupant was not injured. As is usual for notifications like these, the damage extent is not immediately known. Our duty officer quickly reached out to the FAA and triaged the situation at the accident site. And the decision is made that we won't launch, but we will coordinate for a follow-up examination of the engine later. We also spoke to the pilot, and the pilot provided us with a very detailed statement about what happened. In a nutshell, he told us that he was in cruise flight at 3,000 feet when he heard an unusual sound come from the engine, and the engine power began to decrease. He turned the carburetor heat on, but power was not restored. He checked the positions of the fuel selector, and the engine primer didn't help. Light smoke then began to enter the cockpit, and at the same time, a small piece of debris struck the windscreen. The pilot declared an emergency with air traffic control and eventually performed a forced landing to a field. The surface of that field was soft and rough, and the airplane nosed over during the landing. Here's a photo of the vertical stabilizer taken after the airplane was recovered from the accident site. I think this clearly meets our definition of substantial damage, so we'll keep moving forward. We arranged to have the engine examined at the aircraft recovery facility by a representative of the engine manufacturer under the oversight of an FAA inspector. They found that the number 4 cylinder barrel was separated at the midpoint, and the number 4 piston was separated and impact damaged. The number 4 connecting rod was bent, and the number 4 piston pin was missing. They documented the remaining engine components and had no other remarkable findings. We sent the number 4 cylinder and its constituent components to our materials laboratory for detailed analysis. Our metallurgist found that the cylinder had fractured in one of the cooling fin valleys of the cylinder head. Closer examination of the cylinder head side of the fracture surface revealed that a portion exhibited evidence of fatigue cracking. The fatigue features were present along approximately 30% of the fracture surface circumference, and propagated around the cylinder cross-section from a single point. The crack initiation site was located on the exterior surface of the cylinder fin valley. Multiple corrosion pits were present at the fatigue crack initiation site. When we looked at the maintenance records, we saw that the engine had been manufactured in 1970, overhauled in 1996, and had new cylinders installed about 9 years and 1,200 flight hours before the accident. The airplane's most recent annual inspection had been completed about 3 days before the accident. In our analysis, we noted that the alloy used in the engine's cylinders was not necessarily susceptible to pitting, but other issues such as crevice corrosion near an unpainted area or use in salt environments could have led to similar corrosion features. Further, corrosion pits can be a common cause of fatigue cracking. However, the presence of pitting corrosion, to the extent that it was present on this cylinder, which ultimately resulted in its failure, should have been detectable during the inspection and maintenance of the engine. For our third and final case, we're going to go back a little bit further in time, back to when I was still kicking the tin out in the field. The time is July 2011, and the place again is North Carolina. Our initial notification told us that a Cessna 182S had crashed in North Carolina, and that unfortunately, both of the persons on board were fatally injured. We didn't have much other information available in the way of circumstances, and I made my way down to the accident site to assess the situation. En route to the accident site, I learned that the wreckage wasn't immediately accessible because it had come to rest in the middle of the Cape Fear River. Complicating the situation was the fact that upstream officials were delaying a planned release of water from a reservoir, and that we only had about 36 to 48 hours before the water level and current of the river increased, which would further complicate any hope of examining or recovering the wreckage. Unfortunately, this was not a situation where the airplane was insured, so I had to have some very difficult discussions with the pilot's next of kin about what their responsibilities were. This situation worked out in the end, and the pilot's friends in the community put together a crew of folks and some equipment and were able to pull the wreckage out of the water. As we continued to look for clues at the accident site, we found that the first points where trees appeared to be damaged was along the final approach course to the runway at the nearby airport just across the river. Amongst those trees, we found the left wing strut. Where the airplane had come to rest was about 700 feet from that wing strut, along the final approach course and in the river. We continued to document the wreckage. There were lots of things that we looked at in detail, and I'll highlight just a few of those here. Did the entire airplane make it to the accident site, or were there parts spread across great distances? This might suggest we're dealing with some kind of in-flight breakup. In this case, no. Everything was within a couple hundred feet of the main wreckage. Was there an in-flight fire? No. No evidence of an in-flight or post-impact fire. Are we dealing with a possible engine or flight control failure? After looking at the engine and the propeller, we didn't find any issues to suggest that there was a loss of engine power. The impact damage prevented us from fully being able to rule in or out the ailerons, but we were able to confirm control cable continuity from the cockpit to the elevator, rudder, and rudder trim. We were able to determine that the flaps were retracted based on the actuator and indicator positions in the cockpit, as well as the position of the elevator trim. As you can see in this example photo, we tried to document the remainder of the cockpit controls and instruments as best we could. Finally, we recovered a handheld GPS from the wreckage, as this might contain valuable information about the airplane's position, altitude, and speed for the accident flight. We spoke to the pilot's family, and we learned that the pilot was based at the airport near where the accident occurred. On the day before the accident, he and two friends had flown to Mississippi to attend a vehicle auction. One of the friends bought a vehicle and drove it home. The pilot and the other passenger were planning to take the airplane back home. We didn't know at that point in the investigation exactly when the airplane had crashed, only that the pilot didn't arrive home as scheduled, and family members started calling out and trying to figure out what might have happened. The presumption was that the crash had happened sometime that night of the expected return, as the wreckage was found in the river the next morning. We also had a witness reach out to us to say that he had flown at the airport around 11 p.m. on the night of the accident. He didn't see or hear the accident flight, but he described that the weather was VFR, but it was hazy. There were thunderstorms nearby, but not in the immediate vicinity of the airport. He stated that when he activated the airport runway lights about 5 miles from the runway, they were clearly visible. Finally, he said that the area off the end of the runway where the airplane impacted the river was very, very dark at night. And he further described that it was a black hole and it could be very disoriented to fly in this area. This is going to wrap up the first couple of days of this investigation. We've learned a lot so far, but we still don't have the whole story. Next, we'll pick up back home as additional information starts to come in from other sources. After things have calmed down a bit from the first hectic couple days of the investigation, we finally have an opportunity to review some of the pilot logs that we obtained during the on-scene phase. This slide is a summary of what we learned from those logs. The pilot held a private pilot certificate and was instrument rated. He had logged nearly 2,000 hours of flight experience, though he had only logged about 12 hours in the last year. He did not have much night or instrument experience during that time, and he had not logged any flights in the last 9 months before the accident. He did not have any time or endorsements to show that he was instrument current, and his most recent flight review was documented about 5 years before the accident. Let's take a moment for a quick geography lesson to orient ourselves with some places we'll be talking about as we continue this discussion. We remember that the pilot was from Irwin, North Carolina, HRJ, which is at the top right of this slide, relatively close to Fayetteville, North Carolina, FAY. The pilot and the passenger had traveled to Philadelphia, Mississippi, MPE, at the left of the screen. Remember that the plan for the day of the accident was to return from Mississippi to their home in North Carolina. With this in mind, let's look at another piece of information we received a couple days after returning from the scene. We learned that the pilot had contacted flight service via telephone on the afternoon of the accident flight to obtain a briefing for a planned VFR flight. The synopsis of the flight service briefing was that there were scattered thunderstorms along the route of flight. Let's go back to our map and we'll see what airports they discussed. Here we can see the dotted line, which shows roughly the route of flight the pilot and the briefer discussed that would attempt to circumnavigate some of the more serious convective weather that was out there. Between this flight service information and the information the family had learned during their search for the pilot on the night of the accident, as well as the fuel receipts we received from fixed-based operators, we found out that the pilot had flown from MPE to MEI, Meridian, Mississippi, where he had fueled the airplane. He then planned to head east before turning northeast toward Fayetteville, North Carolina. We routinely request air traffic control radar and communication information from the FAA following accidents, and this case was no exception. Sometimes those requests can grow quite large when they encompass a long period of time and a large geographic area. In this case, we had an NTSB ATC subject matter expert help us sort through all of that information and try to make sense of it. From this information, we learned that the pilot contacted ground control at MEI around 5:15 p.m. And I'm going to talk about all of these times in Eastern just to make things a little bit easier on all of us. In that contact, he advised that his planned destination was Columbus, Georgia. He was offered and accepted VFR flight following services before he departed. He was then issued a discrete transponder code and departed at 5:21. He was radar identified by the departure controller shortly after takeoff, and about 5:30 was advised of multiple areas of precipitation within the next 50 miles and offered radar vectors. The pilot acknowledged the offer but didn't ask for vectors. At 5:41, he called ATC, but ATC said that the transmission was unreadable and asked the pilot to switch to a different transmitter. About 2 minutes later, the pilot called ATC again with improved transmission quality and advised ATC that they had broken out into marginally good weather. At 5:44, the departure controller provides a frequency change to Atlanta Center. The pilot initially reads back an incorrect frequency, but then does acknowledge the correct frequency later. By 5:54, the pilot had not checked in with Atlanta Center. About this time, the previous departure controller attempts to contact the pilot, but is unable to get a response, and there are no further transmission from the pilot for the remainder of the flight. ATC continued to track the flight in a NORDO status and attempted to contact the pilot several times, all with no response. By 7:01 p.m., the flight is in the vicinity of Columbus, Georgia, CSG, but continues east. All right, here's where we are on the map at this point in the flight. ATC continued to track the flight on radar as it passed CSG toward Dublin, Georgia, DBN. It then turned northeast toward the area of Fayetteville and HRJ. About 8:45, ATC made their last attempt to reach the pilot via radio. And I want to point out the transition from day to night occurred between 8:30 and 9 p.m. Shortly after 9 p.m., the airplane's transponder code changed from the code that had been assigned previously by ATC for flight following to 1200. The airplane arrived in the vicinity of the pilot's home airport a little after 9:30. As the airplane comes into the home stretch of the flight, let's look at another source of data for flight track. You might remember back during the on-scene phase of the investigation, we recovered a handheld GPS receiver from the wreckage. It was in rough shape physically, as it had been damaged by the crash. Further, it had been submerged in water, which further complicated the possibility of successfully recovering any data from it. Undeterred, our specialists in the Vehicle Recorders Laboratory got to work trying to figure out a way to extract the data inside. Since the device wasn't in a condition to be physically turned on, the data could not be extracted through traditional means, which would usually mean hooking it up to a computer, turning it on, and initiating a download of the data. Instead, the specialists turned to a more exotic method of removing the physical chip containing the memory from the circuit board that it had been soldered to and placing it in a standalone chip reading device, similar to the one shown in the photo at the lower right. Using this method, they were successful in recovering the data, which included the accident flight. The data showed the airplane's flight track for the entirety of the accident flight at a resolution of about one position every 3 seconds. This data was more granular than the one position every 4.8 seconds of the radar data, but also showed a more low altitude data for the final portion of the flight. I want to apologize for the clarity of this plot. The text is a little small, but don't worry. I've highlighted here in yellow the airplane's flight track as it tracked towards the destination airport at the upper right. All right, the plotted track gets a little messy here, or what we in the office might call a bowl of spaghetti. Let's step through chronologically to better understand what's going on. As the airplane arrives in the vicinity of HRJ, it was generally tracking along the runway's final approach course at an altitude of about 1,300 feet. The airplane then turned right and started climbing to about 2,100 feet. About 3 nautical miles southeast of the airport, it makes a 180-degree turn back around and climbing back around and descending to 1,300 feet. Then begins flying northeast. About 3 nautical miles northeast of the airport, it makes another 180-degree turn back towards the final approach course. All right, this is an expanded view of the final portion of the airplane's ground track, showing the runway threshold at the top right, the final approach course in white. Also plotted are the initial impact point we identified during our on-scene examination and where the main wreckage came to rest in the river. The airplane's flight path, plotted in blue, shows that it crossed the final approach course at an altitude of about 2,000 feet before making a 270-degree descending turn. Between the data from all of our position sources, we saw that during its final descent, the airplane descended from 1,800 feet to 700 feet in about 20 seconds at a ground speed of about 140 knots and a calculated vertical descent rate of 4,800 feet per minute. At this point in the investigation, we're a couple of months in. We've got evidence we gathered on the scene, as well as ATC information from the FAA, the GPS data, the pilot's records. We've also looked into some other areas, like the pilot's autopsy and toxicology reports. And they don't indicate any significant issues, other than that they don't medically support a predisposition for incapacitation. Retracing our initial steps through the investigation, is there something that we might have missed in light of this new information that now might help us understand what's going on? It seemed like the pilot was having issues with his communication radios relatively early in the flight. And those issues continued, presumably through the duration of the flight. Doesn't seem like the pilot was physically incapacitated, given the airplane's changing flight path and that the transponder code changed much later into the flight. Was there anything about those radios that we might have overlooked? Let's go back to our on-scene photos and see. I don't think the radios are in a condition that we could do a functional test of them. And that door remains open. But is there anything else we can glean? It looks like the audio panel transmit selector is selected to PA. This PA, or public address position, would allow the pilot to talk to passengers in the cabin when he's pressing the microphone or transmit button, rather than transmitting a signal using one of the airplane's 2 communication radios. If the pilot perhaps inadvertently placed it here when he was transitioning between ATC facilities earlier in the flight, that could explain why he was Nordo. What else might this mean if he was trying to land at his non-towered home airport at night? Let's look at the chart and see. And on our chart, we can see the star L designation says we need to look at the AFD. The AFD tells us that airport lighting is pilot controlled via radio. So if the pilot was unable to transmit, is it possible that when he got to the destination airport, he couldn't really see it or see all of it? And if he was unable to turn those lights on, did he have any other alternative? A quick review of the chart shows another airport about 30 miles away that was equipped with continuous airport lighting. That could have been a diversion option. This might be a reasonable explanation as to why we saw the pilot maneuvering in the vicinity of the runway on our GPS track. He maybe knew where the airport was based on his GPS position. He also might have been attempting a descending turn towards the runway when the airplane struck trees, as our final plot shows us. Given the witness statement describing the area as a disorienting black hole, combined with the pilot's limited recent night and instrument flying experience, this all has the ingredients necessary for spatial disorientation. A consult with one of our human factors subject matter experts, confirms that this is indeed a plausible explanation for what might have happened. Now that we've got a solid theory supported by factual evidence, we can start to craft our final report. First, we'll take all of our supporting information in its most basic form and enter it into the public docket for the investigation. This would include our witness statements, our records examination photographs, the specialist report from ATC and the Vehicle Recorder's Laboratory, the toxicological report, etc. Then we'll write up a factual report that will lay out all the facts in a methodical way so that a reader can more easily digest all of the factual findings without having to sift through a pile of documents. The goal here is to weave together all of these raw facts into a coherent narrative. With the factual report done, I'll also write a draft analysis narrative and a proposed probable cause statement for consideration by the board. And actually, this is where the process gets a little opaque. In a nutshell, long ago, the 5-member board delegated some of their authority to adopt proposed analyses and probable causes to the director of the Office of Aviation Safety. What this means in practice is that my entire investigative report package, public docket, factual report, analysis narrative, and probable cause will be reviewed through a quality control process to check my work and make sure everything looks as it should. That process will also consider my proposed analysis and probable cause, and the final product may or may not look similar to what I initially submitted. This will all be published in a final report that combines the what, the why, and the how. All right, now that we've gone through this case and know a bit more about it, as well as our process to take it from notification to final report, let's talk about some lessons learned. What decisions do you think this pilot could have made differently at various points during the flight that might have resulted in a different outcome? I'm sure you guys are coming up with many. Here's just a couple that I saw. As the pilot was departing on the flight after the refueling stop, I'm not exactly sure what his plan was for the day. He told the controllers at that airport that his destination was Columbus, Georgia. Given his potentially later than anticipated departure time, was he considering stopping short of home? I don't think we'll ever know whether he planned for this to be a night flight or not, but I do think it's a factor in the final outcome that I just can't discount. Don't get me wrong, I think flying at night is great, but unanticipated night flight poses practical complications beyond whether or not a pilot is technically night current. Preparation is key to a successful outcome. I also can't help but wonder what pressures this pilot was facing to get home. This was something we never found out in this case, and I'll be honest that getting information solid enough to support a conclusion of what someone's motivations were can be very difficult, and oftentimes the information we do get amounts to not much more than hearsay. For the purposes of this discussion, I can put myself in that pilot's shoes and imagine the temptation of wanting to make it home to my home airport, to my hangar, to not have to sleep in a hotel. Maybe I need to get back home to go to work the next day. Or maybe my passenger does. Maybe I've got a doctor's appointment. The list goes on and on. But I've seen this story play out over many similar accidents. And so I'll offer you all some advice in the form of a couple questions. Feel free to take it or leave it. What strategies do you use to guard against what the human factors pros call a planned continuation error, or what we might more commonly know as get-there-itis? Do you have personal minimums? And do those minimums account for your actual level of currency and proficiency? Remember that legally current might not always equate to proficient in a given task. When possible, can you pre-plan fallback options? especially when traveling VFR. When the weather takes an unexpected turn or your day drags on a little too long and you find yourself pushing your flight into night unplanned, especially when you might not be proficient in flying at night or in less than ideal weather, it's likely that you're going to be extremely task saturated and less able to make good decisions. Having pre-planned bailout or go no-go points is one way to lighten your cognitive load in the heat of the moment. All right, that's the end of part 1 of this series. I hope you've learned something about our agency, about the work that we do, and who we are. I also hope that you were able to take away some lessons learned from our last case study discussion, and that they might in some small way help to make you a safer pilot. Coming up in May and in September are presentations from 2 amazing investigators that will dive deeper into some different types of investigations, and we'll talk more about some lessons learned during those investigations. I sincerely hope that the information you learned here tonight will provide you with a good foundation going into those presentations. All right, John, if we've got a little bit of time left on the clock, I can take a couple questions.
Yeah, we are right at the top of the hour, and so I understand if some of you have to leave and need to get going, but we do have some questions I think we'd like to ask and answer. If you can hang on for a few more minutes, I will show you how you can get that webinar badge, and also just a reminder, if you are participating in the WINGS program and want to get credit for that, and you didn't sign up using your FAAsafety.gov email, please send that to us in the questions. So our first question tonight goes way back to the beginning, but it's a good one. And this is talking about asking a question about your staffing and the use of contractors. Do you use independent contractors or experts in addition to those 500 or so employees, 125 in the aviation branch? Is that part of the team there? Do you go outside for all that, or some of it, or?
Yeah, so I think you'll mostly see contracting in our support staff. I think most prevalent in like our IT side. As I kind of understand it, there are some parts of what we do, particularly the like investigative side, that are inherently governmental. I think there's maybe some room for some small tasks that maybe we could contract out, and I think that's an interesting idea to explore. But usually, those subject matter tasks and those investigative tasks are just staff.
Okay. This is a good question. Bill wants to know, what kind of background do you need to be an investigator? Is there a career path? Do you come out of college and get into investigating? Do you spend time in the industry first and then get to it? How does that work?
Yeah, I think there's what I've come to see is 3 typical paths of folks who come to work for us. One path is experienced industry folks who have worked in air safety and accident investigation in other capacities, sometimes with those party members that we talked about, so for manufacturers or for operators, but doing specific safety and investigation work. Another path is folks who are in aviation in the military and do safety investigations there, and then transition over to the civil side, and then transition to us. And then the third path is kind of an academic path. We used to have what we called the co-op program. It's now called the Pathways program. And so that's for like college graduates, recent college graduates with specializations in aviation and aviation safety, to kind of come on at a very early entry level and kind of be trained up as kind of long-term employees who would spend longer time than maybe some of those experienced career professionals.
Okay, and you guys do actually have a training academy where you run some courses, correct? I'm assuming probably now is mostly online, but I'm sure there's some hands-on stuff. Is that open to the general public or by invitation? How does that work?
Yeah, I think a lot of those courses are geared towards either training industry professionals who work with us during our investigations, for investigators from foreign aircraft accident investigation boards in other countries that do similar work to us. As far as I know, I think if you have I wouldn't say just an interest in safety, but if you're a student in safety, or if you are in one of those technical jobs, I think that's kind of the bar for entry. But I'd have to refer back to our training center folks for that.
Okay. I have another question here. So it's more of a regulatory question. What are or what can be the repercussions to a pilot or operator if they fail to report an obvious accident to the NTSB? And I'm gonna combine another question with that, kind of the definition of the owner operator. How does that fall? What is an owner? What is an operator? And where are their responsibilities at?
Yeah. So the owner operator is basically the entity that causes the aircraft to be in operation. So it's an easy case where if you own your own airplane and you're the person flying it, you're the owner, you're the operator. If let's say you rent an airplane from a flight school, the flight school is still the operator and you are the pilot. And there's different technicalities of like leasing and long-term leasing versus short-term leasing that maybe change those definitions. But that's the kind of basic term is the operator kind of oversees the aircraft, I guess I would characterize it.
Question here, with ADSB implementation, can flight track data be collected from, say, flightaware.com or ForeFlight or other services like that? And does that help you, or is that part of your investigation and your evidence gathering?
Yes, and actually we have, that's one of the contracts that we have, is with a service provider that gets that aggregated ADSB data and provides it to our air traffic specialists very quickly. So within usually a couple hours after being notified of an accident, an investigator can receive a plot in their email that shows kind of that flight track, and that's a relatively new development. The other part of that question, I wanted to say something else and I can't remember what it was now. So yeah, we definitely do use it. The one thing to remember with that though is depending on where those data sources come from, there's stuff that happens behind the scenes. We call it magic that gets applied to that data. So you can take data from like multiple sensors and fuse it together and kind of get an average position. So for a first quick look, getting kind of that aggregated data that you might see on like ForeFlight or FlightAware gives you a good kind of first swipe at what you might be looking at. But I would not say that that's good data for doing like performance calculations. For that type of work, we actually go to the FAA, make formal requests to get the raw data, and that's what our performance engineers use to do the real hardcore math and performance analysis.
Okay. This question I think is probably going to, well, it's a question I think a lot of folks have, and I know we've talked about this before. But in hearing how you went through your investigation, and particularly that case back in 2011, obviously there's a lot of time involved in gathering the information and then looking at things and trying to figure things out. Is that what contributes to the length of time between the actual accident and that final report? And do you guys have any sort of guidelines or criteria, timelines that you need to fall under to make a good report, or is it kind of as soon as we get everything and we feel reasonably certain, and that may take a long time, do we publish the report?
Yeah, I think the answer in a perfect world, we would publish it as quickly as possible. We know the public wants to know, we know our stakeholders want to know. So there's lots of things that are very kind of the subtle things that contribute to why an investigation might take so long. Some of it is those pieces of material that we're collecting up, and a lot of it is things that are outside of our control. When we kind of talk about like how long does it take to get that air traffic data, how long does it take to do that surgery in the recorder's lab on those recording devices, how long does the medical examiner take to do the autopsy and provide a report on that. Those are just kind of some of those examples that it takes longer than you think it would, and that's kind of the risk in doing a presentation like this, is putting all that information together. It's like, well, there it all is. What took so long? It's like,
right.
But you really kind of miss the nuts and bolts of what it took to generate all that. Is a lot of work, gumshoe work, out in the field.
Well, and the other thing is, I think, and we look at it, you just run the math from 125 investigators and 1,200 cases a year. This isn't the only thing we're working on.
Yeah. And I'll say it's even more it's even more deceptive than that, because that 125 is everybody in aviation safety. About 50 of those are the investigators, the investigators in charge. About 50 of those are the subject matter experts. And then basically the rest of us, like me, are the folks that are kind of running things behind the scenes and making sure everybody's getting paid and all that kind of stuff. Just in
right. Okay. All right. We'll make this our last question, I think, for the evening. This is a good one. Darren asks, considering the congressional mandate to determine probable cause, why is there an extraordinarily high number of undetermined probable causes? And
yeah, so I guess I would characterize that as there are some cases where information just isn't, enough information isn't available. I don't think the mandate is, say, come to some conclusion with a minimal amount of information. We've got to gather as much information as we can that can really support something that's reasonable. So if you get a case, for example, where the wreckage burns to the ground, I've walked up to accident sites where it's literally an outline of an airplane in ash, and so that wreckage isn't going to help us. It's out also in a remote location, and there's like no radar data to support it. There's no recording devices. There's no witnesses. I mean, that's an extreme example of just how little information you can get. And I don't know how we can reach a conclusion other than undetermined. And then there's others that we have some information, but just not enough to get us over a threshold. We still try and give as much information as we can. So can we glean anything from this? And so we'll try and publish some type of factual report with a supporting docket. And so just because that probable cause isn't there, I don't necessarily see that as there's no value or benefit.
Okay. All right. Well, that's going to bring us to the end of our webinar tonight. Just a few things before we go. There was a question, and I'll answer it here for everybody. This webinar will be available on AOPA's website tomorrow, Friday, at webinars.aopa.org. So if you want to watch it again, and I'd highly encourage it, share it with your pilot friends that weren't here tonight. Pass the word around at the airport. This is great information. Plus, we've got 2 more of these coming up in May and September. So I'd encourage you to come back for that. We also have 3 other webinar series that are going on this year. We're looking at Flight Deck Tech. It's a little bit of a mouthful there, but that will be next month in February 17th. And then we're also going to be looking at some backcountry flying and weather flying. So those are in March and April. You can get details on our website at airsafetyinstitute.org. Just scroll down and look for our webinars link. On your screen right here is what you can see is to redeem your AOPA Pilot Passport webinar badge. So if you go to the AOPA app and you can either click on Pilot Passport #1 there, or you can go up above that to the menu at #2, click there, get it to Pilot Passport. In the menu, click on My Pilot Passport #3 on the slide. Then you can go over in there, and at the on My Pilot Passport, that page that you'll come to, My Points and Badges. At the bottom there, you see there's a link, #4. It's called Redeem Affiliate Code. If you click on that or tap on that, you can enter the code. And the code is above the graphic there. It is ASI Web 012022. That's today's date. ASI Web 012022. Go ahead and enter that. That is available through the end of the month. Next month we'll have one for the February badge. Also, again, if you like to get Wings credit for us, make sure we have your Wings email either signed up with it tonight, or you can send it to us in the question mark. We will take care of getting that credit to you within the next few days. So you should see that show up in your Wings account. Again, I'd like to say thank you to Dennis for a fantastic and informative presentation. A lot of work goes on in your office, and I know I speak on behalf of the Air Safety Institute. We appreciate what you do, and I know the rest of the pilot community appreciates what you do. I know it's sometimes not a fun task to try to figure out what went wrong, and as a pilot, you're putting yourself in that position, in that pilot's position, and that takes a toll. But really, thank you to you and your staff for all that you guys do. We really appreciate that. And on behalf of the Air Safety Institute and AOPA, I just want to say thank you for everybody who's attending tonight and watching our webinars. Please come back for our next ones, and have a great evening and fly safe.
Thanks. Good night.